Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream. And today we're talking about 18 excellent movies included with Netflix that you have probably missed. So this is going to be a list of 18 great movies currently included with Netflix. There's a full list of all the movies discussed in the top pinned comment down below for your reference. But if you're new here, we're going to spend about 1 minute per movie talking about why you should watch it, giving you a brief setup with no spoilers. And even though half this list features American movies, the other half of the list is going to take us around the world. We're going to go to places like South Korea, South Africa, India, Spain, France, and even Poland. And we're going to kick it off with a crime movie from France called The Stronghold. This movie follows a squad of police officers as they're engaged in this extremely dangerous neighborhood, including one large building called The Stronghold. Now, this is not really an action movie, even though there are several scenes of action in it. When there is action, it does feel pretty realistic. I mean, this is a fairly grounded police movie, but you are dealing with cops that are kind of living on the edge. They're in very, very dangerous environments, and ultimately there's a pretty good story here that is actually based on some true events. How closely it's related to true events, I'm not really sure. There's good character development and everything like that as well, but the movie does feel a little bit more like an epic starting episode to a series more than it does kind of a complete movie, which is why it's at the back of the list. And if you don't have the energy for subtitles when you watch this movie, like most of the foreign language movies on this particular list, Netflix has a great English dubbed version. Now, my next pick is kind of your standard Jason Statham action movie, except it's a pretty exceptional one, and it's one of his lesser known ones, Wild Card. Now, as I said, this is your pretty standard Jason Statham fare. If you're a fan of his, then this is going to be a great watch. If you typically do not like his movies, there's not going to be a whole lot extra for you to grab onto with Wild Card. And I'll even say the action in Wild Card is not the strongest element. You've actually got some pretty good actors working in this, including a great villain, much better than you typically get in these lower budget action movies. And that's not a knock against the action, it's all solid, it's just not exceptional. As far as Jason Statham movies go, this one is kind of in the middle of the pack, but like I said, if you're a fan of his, this is gonna be a great watch for you. Okay, my next pick is a little bit unusual. It's not the type of movie I typically recommend. In fact, it's kind of an old-fashioned comedy. In fact, it's very old-fashioned and leans maybe a little bit too hard into that, but I still did really enjoy watching She's Funny That Way.
It's fun. Wow, how great. Here's my therapist.
Oh, Jane, look, you have to...
You're fired.
Now, this has the feel of kind of an old school Woody Allen movie. If those are not your bag, then She's Funny That Way is probably not going to appeal to you. But I'll say, even if you're not a fan of Owen Wilson typically, but you like silly, cute, sort of Woody Allen type movies, then this is actually a really great watch. And even though he's a central character, he's actually not in the movie that much. This focuses a lot on Imogen Poots' character. She plays a call girl, and the basic setup here is he's a famous playwright. They spend one night together, and he inspires her and gifts her a bunch of money so she can pursue her dream of acting. She then unknowingly auditions for the lead role in his play, and it causes all sorts of problems. And she's quite good in this movie too, but I'll say Jennifer Aniston's performance in this really stands out. I've always been a fan of hers, but never have really considered her to be like a hard-hitting comedy actor, and she plays a total bitch in this movie, and it is absolutely hysterical. Every scene she's in, I felt like she stole the scene, and I don't know that I've ever said that about Jennifer Aniston. But all in all, this is just sort of a cute movie that makes for a good Netflix watch if you generally like these types of old-fashioned comedies. If you don't though, I've got plenty more for you to choose on this list, including my next pick, which is actually a documentary titled The Legend of Cocaine Island.
A northern fairy tale starts off once upon a time. A southern fairy tale starts off Y'all ain't gonna believe this shit.
Now, this is one of the more fun documentaries you could watch on Netflix right now. This is essentially a story told by a couple of people that actually lived it with some reenactments. And the story is a pretty wild one about a literal ton of cocaine that was buried on an island and a couple of guys who essentially went treasure hunting for it. The people involved are interviewed for this documentary pretty heavily, and they're interesting characters. And then the reenactments are filmed pretty well, and this is just kind of a fun, wild crime story where nobody gets hurt to my recollection. It's just an interesting, unusual story that, again, is told by some really interesting characters. Okay, my next pick is a lesser-known movie featuring some huge stars like Adrien Brody, John Malkovich, and Antonio Banderas in Bullethead. This story features a group of bank robbers that are on the run and they hide out in this abandoned building, but there is a massive man-eating dog on the loose in this building. So they're not able to leave, but they're also not able to stay in the room with this dog, and it becomes this sort of cat and mouse or man and dog chase with some great moments in it. There's some fantastic moments, and even though some things are far-fetched and maybe reach a little bit too far, it still is a really fun watch with some wild-ass moments in it. My next selection on this list is another sort of low-budget action movie, but it's actually two movies because The Debt Collector 1 and Part 2 are both included with Netflix right now. These are some of my more favorite Scott Adkins movies. If you're not familiar with him, he's a long-time stuntman that releases several movies a year, and they're all done at about this budget level. And in terms of low-budget action movies, he is seriously creating some of the best on the market right now. Most in that category are absolute dog shit movies that are not worth your time. Scott Adkins productions, though, are all clever, interesting, there's good humor, and the fight choreography and the action is top-notch, especially for low-budget movies. In these, he plays a debt collector for some sort of crime boss, and he's essentially co-pilot to Louis Mandylor's character, who outacts almost every single movie he's in. This guy is often featured in these lower budget action movies, and his performances are always top-notch. Like, he really does kill it in a surprising way, and you may not pick up on it at first, but he sounds nothing like the main characters in this movie and a lot of the movies that he does. He does real strong character work. Again, for low budget action movies, they don't get a whole lot better than this. My next pick on this list of bangers comes from Spain and features one of my favorite Spanish actors, Luis Tosar, in Eye for an Eye. In this movie, he actually plays a nurse working in a nursing home when an old man is brought in who is actually a crime boss responsible for destroying part of this man's life, and as a nurse, he is able to exact some really precise and terrifying revenge on this crime boss. And no, he doesn't just kill this guy right away. He makes his life a living hell, he makes his family's life a living hell, and it's a really interesting look at what somebody might be capable of. Luis Tosar really carries this thing. I absolutely love him in every movie he's in. He's a fantastic actor, and he's on screen for most of this movie, and he really makes this thing work where you're kind of rooting for this nurse that's torturing an old man. Something that you might not likely do in any other circumstance, but it works in this movie. Again, dubbed in English, and it's dubbed quite well if you're not in the mood for subtitles when you decide to watch this one. If you like old Hitchcock stuff, then this is going to be a great pick for you. The next movie on this list is the last real true comedy on this particular list, but it's also one of the funniest movies to have been recently added to Netflix. A good old-fashioned orgy. Now, I spoke about this in a recent episode when I told you about all the new stuff coming to Netflix in September, but this has an amazing cast featuring Jason Sudeikis, Leslie Bibb, Lake Bell, Nick Kroll, Will Forte, and Tyler Labine. They're all incredibly funny in this movie, and the thing that really kicks this thing off is it's about a group of old friends that always have these huge blowout parties, but they're getting older and that part of their life is fading, and they decide to go out with a bang with their first orgy orgy. And so the bulk of the movie is leading up to it. It's them planning this orgy, and they are not orgy people, which is where most of the humor comes in, and it really is funny stuff. As far as like adult comedies that are pretty sex-centric, they don't make a whole lot of them anymore because everybody's so fucking sensitive now, but this is a really great one that came out just a handful of years ago, and I know most of you watching haven't seen it yet. Now to talk about something a little more morbid. If you didn't know, if somebody is killed in your house and there's blood and brains or guts all over the walls and the furniture, it's your responsibility to get that cleaned up, meaning the coroner doesn't come in and remove all of that stuff for you. So you actually have to hire a cleaning service with expertise in getting blood out of furniture. In my next pick, Cleaner, Samuel L. Jackson plays one of these professionals. And at the start of the movie, it's an interesting look into what somebody does for a living. I mean, this is a real job that people all over the world have, so it's interesting enough to watch that unfold. However, as you might expect, things are not what they seem, and someone actually uses this service to cover up a crime, which is where Samuel L. Jackson's character gets sucked into a really devious plot that puts him way over his head. This is an excellent little low-budget crime movie that has stellar performances, not just from him, but Eva Mendes is great in this, and Ed Harris. So if you generally like good, solid mystery movies, this is one of the better ones on Netflix right now. And I know it's a lesser-known movie because it's kind of one of those straight-to-video movies from about 10 years ago. That said, included on Netflix, you're gonna have a hard time finding a better mystery to watch right now. All right, now let's talk about a modern warfare movie from Canada called Hyena Road. This movie was actually filmed in Afghanistan and looks very authentic, but this movie does feature a lower budget than most warfare movies, and it does show a bit. However, the story and everything else works well enough that it keeps you really glued into it, and these small production flaws that, again, I noticed, and I think most of you will notice, they're not too distracting because, again, the story is strong enough to carry you through this thing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing on this movie. It's not horrible in terms of its production value, but it is lower than a lot of warfare movies typically are. There are some really great moments in this where there's some pretty poignant things said, not just about war, but about the war in Afghanistan particularly. Things that almost foreshadowed what was actually going to happen with that war. There are some upsetting elements in this, as there are in all war movies, but given the current state of that country, there are things that might be more upsetting than they were back when this movie was originally released, so I don't know, man. Keep that in mind. But if you haven't seen a good modern warfare movie in quite a while, Hyena Road is a great one. Just keep in mind, you are going to notice some production flaws. Now, The Legend of Cocaine Island is definitely one of the more fun documentaries you can watch on Netflix right now, but my next pick is a documentary that is one of the more disturbing ones you could watch on Netflix right now, Abducted in Plain Sight. This movie centers around a naive, church-going family from Idaho who end up basically under the spell of a sociopathic neighbor who has a horrifyingly inappropriate interest in their 12-year-old daughter. So this one, like I said, is going to be upsetting, but it's also a wild look into how people can be manipulated. There are crazy things that unfold in this story that you almost wouldn't believe if you didn't hear it directly from the people who fell for such a wild story. I'm telling you, not only is this one twisted, but it features some insane twists and turns. And it's only about 90 minutes. They don't stretch it out into a 6 or 8 hour documentary series. Okay, the next movie on this list comes from South Africa, and it's actually a Netflix original that was just recently released, and I wanted to rank it higher, but I couldn't, and I'll explain why.
This is bad.
Calm down. Tara, your side.
The Silverton Siege is based on a true story about a hostage situation in Pretoria, South Africa in 1980. One of the demands in this hostage situation was the release of Nelson Mandela. Now, this is a very well done movie. It looks great. The performances are fantastic. It is all in English with a couple of exceptions here and there, and it's got great sequences in it that feel very raw and real. In fact, when I was watching this, it does feel like a great representation of an actual event. However, when I looked things up after the fact, it doesn't have that much in common with the real story. A key example, one of the main three characters is a woman in this movie. They were three men in the original story. Here, they only ask for the release of Nelson Mandela. In the true story, they asked for money and a bunch of other things too. So it's kind of a made-up representation of like a hostage situation that's loosely based on something real. So I think if you go into it with that expectation, this is a really great movie. I was just a little disappointed because I felt like I was watching something that was a real representation, and they took a lot of liberties with a movie that otherwise feels pretty grounded and realistic. If that's not for you though, my next pick is anything but grounded and realistic. It comes from South Korea, and it's also a recently released Netflix original titled Carter. This is an all-out action movie I would most closely relate to Hardcore Henry. While this isn't filmed in the first-person point of view, it is filmed as if it's one long take, and the movie itself does feature a lot of really long takes packed with action. Now, this movie's not the most technically proficient thing I've ever seen. There are other movies that are done in one take, movies like 1918, that are almost imperceivable. You can't even tell that they're switching shots. Here, I felt like I could constantly tell when the camera was changing, but I didn't mind because the action was so wild and bombastic. And it's over 2 hours of non-stop action, and that's not hyperbolic. It really does kick off within like 3 minutes, and the action almost never stops. The main character is able to catch his breath a few times throughout the story, and I will say I have this ranked above some movies that are better made, I guess, with better stories and better performances, but the wild nature of Carter is so fun to watch and so over the top. I ranked it higher here just for pure entertainment value. If you love insane over the top action movies, I'm telling you, Carter is one of the best to have been released this year, including theatrical releases. If that is not enough action for you, we're gonna go to India with my next pick, which is a sequel, Bahubali 2. Now, I talked about Bahubali on a recent video. I'll link to that in the description below. I do recommend that movie. I actually like Bahubali 2 better. The story kicks off faster, there's more action in it, and I felt like the action itself was a lot more fun and engaging than the original Bahubali, which I do recommend. Now, if you've never watched a movie from India before, Bahubali 2 may not be the first one you want to check out. I also recommend a movie titled RRR, which you can also check out on Netflix right now. However, if you got that recommendation from me and you loved it, I strongly recommend checking out the Bahubali series. I hate to keep pointing out production flaws, but I did notice quite a bit in the original Bahubali. I could always tell they were on sets. I know fake grass when I see it, things like that. There weren't really those issues with Bahubali 2. It had a bigger budget and has some incredibly grand moments in it. But it's worth noting that this is practically like an Indian superhero movie. While they're not really superheroes, the main characters are, without a doubt, superhuman. They're almost these like Herculean, legendary type characters. And this is a fantasy movie. There's flying ships and big creatures and all sorts of stuff. And because it's from India, it is very different from American-made movies. I've mentioned several movies from South Korea on this list, and while they have their cultural differences, the movies do feel a lot like American crime movies. Bahubali and a lot of the movies I've been watching from India have their own unique flavor. They feel like they're only from India, and when you watch it, you'll see what I mean. Do not expect this to look and feel like something you've seen before. It's quite different and quite entertaining as a result. Now, while Bahubali was easily the most epic movie on this list, and honestly probably one of the most epic movies on Netflix right now, my next pick is not only a small indie flick, but it's a very small story about a father and daughter. It stars Ben Foster in Leave No Trace. Now, this is a somewhat recent release, and in this movie, he and his teenage daughter are living off the grid. They're living out in the woods, and no, this isn't some post-apocalyptic thing. This takes place in modern day, and the reason why they're doing that is really the journey with this story. Ben Foster, as usual, gives an amazing performance in this movie. Thomasin McKenzie plays the teenage daughter, and she's really not just the star in the movie, but she really is the main character. This is very much about her developing and becoming her own person and needing to separate from her father, who clearly has some problems. Just good, solid drama work for both of them. This is really well directed. If you like really good, intense, personal drama movies, then Leave No Trace is easily one of the best recently added to Netflix. Okay, I promised you a movie from Poland, and Furiosa is a gangster movie that is Polish language. They do have a good dubbed English version, but it's a gangster movie unlike anything I've seen, and I think that's because Polish gangs must operate very differently from gangs here in the US and other countries. In fact, they almost make a sport out of it in this movie. There are some insane characters in this movie that really do carry it and make Furiosa incredibly interesting, but there is a core story here with some undercover work, and it all develops really well. In fact, this feels almost like a serious Point Break. They're not robbing banks or jumping out of airplanes or certainly not surfing, but you're dealing with an undercover agent with a gang, and at times reminded me of Point Break, but a much more raw, realistic version of something like that. If you generally like the crime and gangster movies that I recommend here, and I recommend a lot of them, Furiosa comes in at number 3 on a list of excellent movies. Now, I believe it's probably easier to teach a good stuntman how to act than it is to teach an actor how to become a good stuntman, and that is what happened with my next pick, Lost Bullet. This is a Netflix original from France. Again, the dubbed English version is great with this movie, but Lost Bullet is a stunt-heavy car movie. They don't make many of these anymore. I know what you're thinking, they make Fast and the Furious movies every year. A lot of those stunts are done with mostly CGI. Here in Lost Bullet, most, if not everything you're seeing is in camera, it's real. I mean, even when the main character is driving a car on fire and flames are flicking into the windows as he's driving, 100% in camera at real speeds. When there's crashes, debris flies everywhere. This is an incredible stunt movie with some great moments in it, but as I said, the main character is the stuntman. You're not seeing a stunt double. He's doing everything, and his acting is quite good, at least I think it is. I mean, I don't speak the native language, and the dubbed version is not him, but this is actually an excellent crime movie, again, with some really great undercover elements, and don't forget, top-notch action. In fact, this movie is so good, they are working on a sequel. In fact, there's already a teaser trailer available on Netflix with no release date yet, but it's looking like we might get to see Lost Bullet 2 before too much longer. And then, unfortunately, my number 1 pick does not have an English dubbed version. It comes from South Korea, so you will have to read subtitles. I did not factor that in, though, when I placed it at the number 1 spot. It earned that spot because this is one of my favorite crime movies I've seen from South Korea in quite a while, and I love me some South Korean crime flicks. Veteran was released in 2015 and follows a really eccentric cop tracking down not just a criminal, but a really high-powered criminal. And while Veteran has a good, solid story, has some really great scenes of action that are shot really well, this is a top-notch production. This does not have the production flaws like I talked about in some other movies on this list. All that stuff's great, but the 2 main characters are the real reason to watch this. The cop is kind of this funny guy. You wouldn't quite call this movie a comedy, but there's a lot of funny elements, and they mostly come from him. He's got a really great personality, and he's a very interesting character to follow through this story, but he's also a really good cop with a hard edge, so that's all fun. Then the villain is not only really wicked and evil, the actor playing him, I've seen him in quite a few movies from South Korea. He's obviously a big star there. He is a murderer in this movie, and I don't just mean that he murders people, which he does. He kills this performance. He's also kind of fun to watch in this really wicked way, and so that is the balance with Veteran, is these two characters. They're fleshed out, and they're stronger characters than I've seen in most movies in this genre. And then, of course, on top of that, it's just a really good crime movie. So if it's been a while since you've seen something really good from South Korea, this is one of my favorite things I've seen within the past year or so out of that country. And they make some great movies over there. Movies I recommend on this channel all the time. Speaking of that, if you're new here and you're still watching this video to the end, definitely click that subscribe button and the little bell icon. That way you get notified when videos like this release so you don't miss the movies before they're gone. If you want even more recommendations, I've put a couple links to some recent videos in the video description. Or you can go check out DarrenVanDam.com. I'll put a link to that in the description too. I've got movie recommendations right there on the homepage from a bunch of different streaming services and access to back catalog episodes, so you will literally never run out of good movies to watch. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this Netflix episode, and you will see me on the next one.